Oscar Piastri's nightmare Brazil weekend included being slapped with a controversial penalty for a three-way collision, but Charles Leclerc, who was eliminated by that crash, doesn't think Piastri deserved that penalty, one that's potentially delivered a killer blow to his F1 title hopes. As if crashing out of the sprint race and then qualifying behind McLaren teammate Lando Norris for the third successive race wasn't bad enough, Piastri's Sunday was wrecked by a 10-second penalty for pinging Kimi Antonelli's Mercedes into Leclerc's Ferrari. That ruined what could have turned out to be a decent recovery to second place for Piastri, who, rather than losing 7 points to Norris, lost 15 points, dropping him to almost a whole race win's worth of points short of Norris with just 3 rounds to go. It arguably means Norris has one hand on the title now, with Piastri needing a serious turnaround in form to stop his teammate romping to a title that he once looked so set for. Now, as we'll get to later in the video, Piastri's fundamental problem was a continued pace deficit to Norris when it mattered. But Piastri has every reason to be annoyed by yet another steward's decision going against him. Don't forget Silverstone, where Piastri lost victory to Norris due to a 10-second time penalty for erratic driving behind the safety car. The lost points there certainly look a lot more crucial now Piastri's gone from semi-comfortable points leader to a rapidly drifting runner-up. Piastri felt that the Silverstone penalty robbed him of the result he deserved, while in Brazil he questioned where his McLaren was supposed to disappear to, with his team boss Andrea Stella calling the penalty harsh. Now, you'd expect the offending driver and team to push back against the penalty, but even the biggest victim of the crash, neutral third party Leclerc, thought Piastri's penalty was harsh. Leclerc said, "For me, it was a bit of a 50-50 racing incident." He believed Piastri was a bit optimistic, but Antonelli turned into the corner like Piastri wasn't on his inside. And the justification for Piastri's penalty points to a new flaw with F1's racing guidelines. Piastri was ultimately doomed by the Brazil stewards rigidly applying what's written in the driving standard guidelines, which, don't forget, were created at the request of the teams and drivers to be used by the stewards when deciding penalties. Those require the overtaking driver to have the front axle of their car at least alongside the mirror of the car that they're overtaking at the apex of the corner. Looking purely at the letter of that guideline, Piastri fell foul of that because he didn't have his front axle alongside the mirror of Antonelli's Mercedes, so therefore was wholly responsible for the collision. The stewards felt a punishment of a 10-second time penalty and 2 penalty points was most appropriate, and in line with previous incidents. Essentially, Piastri needed to be further alongside Antonelli while still remaining under control, something Piastri doesn't think was possible. Piastri said he'd have understood if he was understeering, missing the apex and slamming into Antonelli, but he felt he had his McLaren under control and as far to the left-hand side as possible before Antonelli squeezed him. Piastri was basically punished for not barreling down the inside of Antonelli more, probably clobbering Antonelli in the process and taking out Leclerc anyway, just to claim a specific bit of track position by the apex. This wholly two-dimensional approach to devising racing rules means shared accountability has gone out of the window. The racing guidelines were already flawed in their first form, and the changes for 2025 have created new problems. Racing is being redefined in F1 as a dash for the apex. The high-risk move around the outside has been made even harder, and now it's also clear the guidelines can absolve a driver of blame who pins another driver into a corner and clearly contributes to an accident. Piastri sensed this was the best chance yet to pass one or both cars together and was entitled to go to the move on the inside. He had a great run, got more than far enough alongside Antonelli to contest the braking zone, and stayed in control enough to not have done anything outlandish. Yes, there was the lockup from Piastri, but not one that actually lost him control of the car. He was slowing down, tight to the inside, clearly capable of making the corner. The lockup was a very visible consequence of trying to brake a little more in response to Antonelli closing the space off. To quote Jolyon Palmer during F1 TV's commentary, "It looks bad in the end for Piastri. It ultimately makes him look more guilty than he probably was in that." That's not to say Antonelli deserved the penalty. It was an incident that did not need a punishment based on the general principles of racing, but the guidelines essentially demanded one. So the penalty was right, for the wrong reasons, and actually quite easy to see coming once the replays determined the positions of the two cars. But even without that penalty, Norris had Piastri's number all weekend for the third consecutive weekend. Piastri and McLaren hoped Interlagos would end his slump after a miserable Austin-Mexico doubleheader that obliterated his 22-point championship lead. And the early signs were promising, with Piastri completing a McLaren 1-2 in the sole practice session on Friday. just 0.02 slower than Norris, far less than the 2 to 3/10 gap across much of Austin and Mexico. He was right with him in SQ2, but Piastri couldn't deliver when it mattered in the final stage of sprint qualifying, ending up 0.2 slower and third on the grid. Things went from bad to worse in the sprint race, with Piastri losing control of his McLaren through turn 3 and suffering his third race-ending crash in 5 rounds. It's easy to have some sympathy for Piastri here, given that teammate Norris had dragged some water onto the curb that Piastri ran over, Mario Kart style, as George Russell joked. But given the tricky conditions were the same for everyone, it has to go down as another major error that cost Piastri a sprint podium and at least 6 points to Norris. He didn't exactly respond in style later that day in Grand Prix qualifying either, ending up 4th with Antonelli and Leclerc in between Norris and himself. That put him in a position where he needed to take some risks, like the attempted double overtake. That did actually put him into second place behind Norris while the stewards were deliberating what to do, but Piastri couldn't make any impression on his teammate. By the time Norris made his first pit stop, Piastri had fallen to 7 seconds adrift of Norris after 30 laps, and then after serving his penalty, despite flashes of better pace on his subsequent soft and medium stints, he couldn't progress any further than 5th. Stella says the lockup from the Antonelli-Leclerc clash had damaged Piastri's mediums in the first stint, and described the pace of his second and third stints as quite encouraging. The problem was that Piastri had cooked his tyres by the time he was close enough to George Russell's Mercedes, so he was only able to pick off the leading midfield cars late on, like Ollie Behrman's Haas and Liam Lawson's Racing Bulls. But even with the damaged opening stint tyre and traffic problems later, Piastri was clearly a step behind Norris once the conditions evolved past where they were in FP1. What Piastri referred to as odd behaviour from the tyres and their lack of grip meant Interlagos became another weekend where Norris's driving style, where he copes better with a sliding car, was more suited to what was needed. There was plenty of head scratching from Piastri about what had happened over the weekend, calling the soft tyre behaviour very strange and the grip levels in Saturday qualifying very bizarre, with such little lap time improvement from Q1 to Q3. In fact, Norris's Q1 time would have actually got him pole. And a unique element to this particular Interlagos weekend only seemed to heighten Piastri's struggles. Want to quiz Ed Straw about where he's placed Piastri in this week's driver rankings? Well, this week you can do just that on the Race Members Club completely free. Simply click on the link below to get all the bonus content, ad-free videos and podcasts we publish from the 5th to the 12th of November, absolutely free. One intriguing extra factor that shifted things away from Piastri was a consequence of what appeared to be some relatively minor track changes made to Interlagos. Following the wet weather dramas last year, Brazilian organisers had cut drainage grooves into several areas of the track to help provide channels that disperse water. While these grooves are present at other tracks, it's believed this was the first time that they have ever been cut into areas of the track where cars are grip limited. The grooves may not look like the sort of thing that should be relevant to lap time. However, with the extremely narrow performance window that current F1 cars operate in, there were 2 impacts from the grooves. The first was that by the cars running across the ridges, the tyres had less contact patch with the track than normal, so slid more and this increased tyre degradation. But the groove also triggered some car setup headaches as well. Current F1 car performance is dominated by airflow under the car, and the more consistent that flow is and the lower you can run it, the better it is. McLaren was one of those teams that found after the sprint, in order to ensure it was not caught out by its plank wearing too much, it had to lift its ride height to play it safe. This created a performance compromise by reducing downforce potential. Piastri said McLaren had to take the car in a direction that went away from his usual style during the weekend. A subtle change, but enough to make a big difference when the margins are so tiny. Piastri readily accepts that things have not been easy for him in recent races when grip levels have been low, as it requires a totally different driving style than what he established at the start of the year. He said it's very difficult to move away from the style we've been using all season. Piastri's hope now is that the next venue in Las Vegas offers him the conditions he needs to rediscover the confidence that put him in a once commanding championship position. The problem for Piastri is Las Vegas hasn't exactly been McLaren's happiest of hunting grounds, nor the grippiest of racetracks during its first 2 years on the calendar. So if Piastri can't turn things around in low grip conditions, then there's every chance a big title blow in Brazil will be followed by a definitively fatal one in Vegas.